The dust of Redemption Gulch is a fine, red powder that coats everything. The tired horses at the hitching rail, the false fronts of the businesses, the hope in a man's heart. Elias Thorne feels it in his throat as he watches the afternoon train hiss to a stop, a black iron beast panting steam into the thin, dry air. He isn't here for passengers. He's here for a barrel of nails and 3 sacks of flour, essentials he can barely afford, the cost of which will add another line to his running tab with Miller's Mercantile. He leans against a support post of the station's overhang, his worn duster doing little to soften the sharp angle of the wood against his shoulder blade. At 32, Elias wore the weary look of a man a decade older. His father's ranch, now his, was a relentless beast that consumed sweat and dollars and gave back little but dust and disappointment. He was a man accustomed to solitude, his only conversations held with his horse, a stoic gelding named Boulder, and the ghosts of his own failed ambitions. The passengers disembark. A drummer in a loud suit, a family with too many children and not enough luggage, and then a woman alone. She pauses on the top step of the passenger car, her hand gripping the rail. She's young, maybe not even 20. Her dress is a plain, dark wool, made for travel and not for turning heads. But it's her face that snags Elias's attention, holding it fast. The left side, from her temple down to her jaw, is a ruin of mottled purple and swollen blue-black. The bruise is ugly, stark against the pallor of her skin. She keeps her chin high, a gesture of defiance that seems to cost her a great deal. In her other hand, she clutches a small, worn satchel and a single, sealed envelope, holding it as if it were both a shield and a prayer. Elias's gaze flicks from her to the man waiting on the platform, Jedediah Finch, a man whose wealth was as new as his smile was false. Finch had bought up the old Miller homestead and was slowly trying to squeeze out the smaller ranchers like Elias, buying up water rights and leveraging debt. He was dressed in a tailored city coat, his boots polished to a mirror shine, a stark contrast to the worn-out denim and scuffed leather of the men who actually worked the land. He was waiting for her, the mail-order bride he'd been boasting about in the saloon for a month. The woman, Clara her name must be, descends the steps carefully, her eyes fixed on Finch. She doesn't smile. She looks like a condemned prisoner approaching the gallows. Finch's smile is a tight, predatory thing. He takes a step toward her, his eyes doing a swift, dismissive appraisal. He sees the dress, the cheap satchel, and then his gaze locks on her bruised face. The smile vanishes, replaced by a sneer of pure disgust. "What in God's name is this?" he says, his voice low but carrying in the sudden quiet of the platform. The station master has stopped loading a crate. The family with the children has paused to stare. The young woman flinches, but her voice is steady, if quiet. "Mr. Finch? I am Clara Maeve." "I can see that," he snaps. "I sent for a bride, not a barroom brawler. What happened to your face?" There was a mishap during the journey," she murmurs, her gaze dropping to the wooden planks of the platform. It's a lie, and a poor one. The bruise is too fresh, the fear in her eyes too raw. Finch lets out a short, derisive laugh. "A mishap. I paid your passage for a respectable woman to be the mistress of my home, not some damaged goods who gets into scrapes. Look at you. You're a disgrace." Each word is a lash. Elias feels a slow, hot burn start in his gut. He knows Finch, knows the casual cruelty he wields like a riding crop. He sees the woman's knuckles, white where she grips the letter. She is trembling, a fine, barely perceptible tremor running through her. "I am not. I am respectable," she says, her voice shaking now. "You're an embarrassment," Finch declares, loud enough for everyone to hear. He takes a step back, making a show of distancing himself from her. "The deal is off. I won't have you. Find your own way back to whatever gutter you crawled out of." He turns his back on her, a final, brutal dismissal. The train gives a mournful whistle, preparing for its departure. The woman stands frozen, a solitary island in a sea of gawking strangers. Abandoned, humiliated. The bruise on her face seems to pulse with a deeper, more profound pain. Elias sees the glint of tears in her eyes, fiercely held back. He sees the town, a place that would offer no solace, only judgment. He sees Finch striding away, proud and unencumbered. And something in Elias, something long dormant and buried under layers of debt and weariness, breaks. It's not a thought. It's an impulse, a raw, undeniable imperative. He pushes himself off the post, his boots making a solid, deliberate sound on the planks. He walks past the staring family, past the station master, and stops in front of the girl. She looks up at him, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. He's just another stranger, a tall, grim-faced man with eyes the color of a winter sky. He doesn't look at her face. He looks at Finch's retreating back. "She'll come with me," Elias says. The words are quiet, rough with disuse, but they cut through the afternoon air with the finality of a slammed door. Finch stops and turns, an expression of disbelief on his face. The woman, Clara, stares at Elias, her mouth slightly agape. The mysterious letter is still clutched in her hand, a forgotten anchor in the sudden storm of this stranger's intervention. With 3 words, his life, and hers, were irrevocably changed. The ride back to Elias's ranch was a study in silence. He'd collected his nails and flour, paid for them with a promise, and settled Clara's small satchel in the wagon bed. He'd helped her up onto the seat, his hand briefly touching her elbow. She felt as fragile as a sparrow, and just as tense. Now, she sat ramrod straight, her hands clenched in her lap, the mysterious letter tucked safely into a pocket of her dress. She stared straight ahead at the rumps of the 2 draft horses, watching the unending panorama of sagebrush and rock unfold before them. Elias didn't press her for conversation. The humiliation on the platform had been a public flogging. The girl needed silence more than she needed questions. He could feel the town's eyes on his back as they'd pulled away from the mercantile, could hear the whispers already starting. Thorne and Finch's bruised bride. It would be all over Redemption Gulch by sundown. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. The swelling around her eye was pronounced, the skin tight and shiny. It was a vicious blow, struck with a fist or the back of a hand. Not a mishap. He knew the look of it. He'd seen it enough in saloon brawls, but never on the face of a woman. The sight of it stirred a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years, an anger that was cold and clean. His ranch was nestled in a small, defensible valley 12 miles northeast of town. The final stretch of the road was little more than a pair of ruts carved into the earth, winding through low hills dotted with juniper and pine. When the cabin came into view, he felt a familiar pang of something that was half pride, half shame. It was a sturdy, 2-room structure built of lodgepole pine by his father's own hands. But the roof needed patching, the porch rail was loose, and the paint had long since surrendered to the sun and snow. Beyond it stood a barn in similar condition and a web of fences in constant need of mending. It was a place of endless work and dwindling hope. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch. "We're here." Clara looked at the cabin, her expression unreadable. She took in the sagging porch, the lonely curl of smoke from the chimney, the vast, empty wilderness that surrounded them. If she was disappointed, she didn't show it. Perhaps after the welcome she'd received from Finch, this quiet desolation was a relief. "It's quiet," she said, her first words since they'd left town. "It's always quiet," Elias confirmed, climbing down. He came around to her side of the wagon. "Watch your step." He offered a hand. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her small, calloused hand in his. He helped her down, her weight almost nothing. As her feet touched the ground, she swayed slightly, and he steadied her, his hands on her arms. For a moment, they stood there, close enough for him to smell the faint scent of soap and train smoke clinging to her clothes. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the pain she was trying so hard to conceal. He released her quickly, stepping back. "The cabin has 2 rooms," he said, his voice gruff to cover the awkwardness. "The main room and a small bedroom. You can have the bedroom." She just nodded, her gaze fixed on the front door as if it were the gate to another world. "I'll get your things." He retrieved her satchel from the wagon. It was light, everything she owned in the world, it seemed. He led the way inside. The main room was sparse but clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a fire already laid and waiting for a match. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A dry sink, a wood-burning stove, and shelves holding a meager collection of plates and tins lined the back wall. It was a man's space, functional and unadorned. He gestured to a closed door. "That's the bedroom." There's a bed, a dresser. The mattress is stuffed with corn husks, but it's clean. Thank you, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Elias. The name felt strange on his own tongue. No one had called him by his first name in a long time. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and he saw a flicker of something in her gaze. Not just fear, but a cautious, searching intelligence. Why did you do it? In town. Elias set her satchel down by the bedroom door. He turned and busied himself with striking a match to the kindling in the hearth. He needed to look at the fire, not at her bruised face. Couldn't leave you there, he said simply, watching the flames lick at the dry wood. Finch. And this town ain't kind to women on their own. You've made an enemy of him. He was no friend to begin with. The fire caught, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. He straightened up and finally met her eyes again. You're safe here, Clara. No one will bother you. The promise hung in the air between them, heavy and real. For a man who owned so little, it was the most valuable thing he had to give. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acceptance of the terms. She picked up her satchel and disappeared into the small bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Elias stood alone in the main room, the silence of the cabin settling around him once more, but it was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of the woman in the next room, a woman with a bruised face and a secret she held clutched in an envelope. He had acted on an impulse, a moment of righteous anger. Now, in the quiet of his home, the consequences began to settle in. He had a stranger under his roof, an enemy in town, and a whole new set of troubles he couldn't even begin to measure. The first few days passed in a state of quiet, formal courtesy. Clara kept to herself, emerging from the small bedroom only for meals or to use the wash basin. She was a ghost in his house, silent and watchful. Elias could feel her eyes on him as he went about his chores, her gaze trailing him as he chopped wood or tended to the horses. It wasn't a fearful look, but an assessing one. She was taking his measure. He tried to give her space, to make her feel safe. He'd leave a plate of food on the table for her if he was heading out to the fences, or ensure there was always hot water in the kettle on the stove. They spoke only when necessary, their conversations clipped and practical. The stew is good. Thank you. I'll be back before dark. All right. On the third morning, Elias rose before dawn, as was his habit. He moved quietly, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. When he turned from the stove, he was surprised to see Clara standing in the doorway of the main room. She was dressed, her hair neatly braided, but she held a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her face was pale in the pre-dawn gloom. Couldn't sleep? He asked, his voice low. She shook her head. A bad dream. He nodded, understanding more than she knew. He poured 2 cups of coffee, pushed one across the table toward her. She sat down, her movements stiff. She wrapped her cold hands around the warm tin cup, but didn't drink. At the orphanage, she said suddenly, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. The nights were the worst. You could hear everything. Every girl who cried. It was the first piece of her past she had offered him, a small, fragile stone dropped into the deep well of his ignorance about her. An orphan. It explained the cheap dress, the desperation that would lead a woman to answer an ad from a man like Finch. You don't have to talk about it, he said gently. I know. She finally took a sip of the coffee. Mr. Finch, he seemed so proper in his letters. He wrote of his standing in the community, of the fine house he was building. He promised a good life. Finch promises whatever suits him in the moment, Elias said, his voice hard. His word isn't worth the breath it's spoken on. She looked down at her cup. When I arrived, he took me to his house before we even left the station. He said he needed to inspect his purchase. The words were delivered without emotion, a flat recitation of a horror. When I asked him about my sister, he got angry. That's when she trailed off, her hand instinctively rising to touch her bruised cheek. Your sister? Elias asked, keeping his voice even. A mask of caution fell over her face. She had said too much. It's nothing. She was supposed to be here. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the wood floor. Thank you for the coffee. I should make myself useful. Before he could say another word, she had retreated. The conversation was over, but it left him with a new piece of the puzzle. A sister. A question that had earned her a beating. The mystery of her presence in Redemption Gulch deepened. Later that day, Elias was in the barn, trying to repair a broken harness strap with stiff, cold fingers. The leather was old and cracked, much like everything else he owned. He was so focused on his work that he didn't hear her approach. "Can I help?" He looked up. Clara stood in the wide doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. She had a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "I can manage," he said, more out of habit than conviction. She stepped inside, letting her eyes adjust to the dim, dusty interior. The barn smelled of hay and horse and old leather. "At the orphanage, I worked in the mending room. And the kitchens. And the laundry. I know how to work." There was a quiet pride in her voice. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden." "I want to earn my keep," she insisted. She walked over and looked at the harness in his hands. "You need an awl and a wax thread. Your stitching is coming undone." He stared at her, surprised. He handed her the broken strap. She took it, her fingers tracing the frayed stitching with an expert's touch. "There's a small mending kit in my satchel. If you have any spare leather, I can patch this properly." He found a scrap piece for her and watched as she went to fetch her kit. She returned and sat on an overturned bucket, her head bent over her work. Her fingers were nimble and sure. She worked with a focused, practiced efficiency that spoke of years of such labor. In the quiet of the barn, with the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light from the high windows, Elias saw her for the first time not as a victim or a mystery, but as a person of quiet competence. She wasn't just the girl with the bruised face. She was Clara Maeve, who knew how to mend a harness. The fragile piece of their arrangement was shattered a week later. Elias needed to go to town for salt licks for the horses and to see if a letter from the bank had arrived, a letter he was dreading. He told Clara to keep the door bolted and not to open it for anyone. He'd barely tied Boulder to the rail outside the mercantile when Sam Miller, the proprietor, came out to meet him on the boardwalk. "Elias," Sam said, wiping his hands on his apron. He was a decent man, but a notorious gossip. "Town's buzzing." "Town's always buzzing about something," Elias said, not looking at him. "It's buzzing about you. About that girl you took in. Finch is telling everyone you stole his intended, that she's a woman of low character and you're no better for harboring her." Elias's jaw tightened. "Finch can say what he likes." "It's more than talk," Sam warned, lowering his voice. "He's the chairman of the bank, Elias. He holds the note on your land. You know that. He's been telling folks he plans to call it in. Says you're a moral risk." The cold dread Elias had been living with for years intensified. Finch wasn't just going to make him an outcast. He was going to ruin him. He was going to take his father's ranch. "I'll handle Finch," Elias said, his voice flat. "Be careful," Sam said, his expression troubled. "The man has a long reach." Elias bought his salt licks, his mind churning. There was no letter from the bank, which was somehow worse than receiving a bad one. The uncertainty was a weight on his soul. He was loading the supplies into his saddlebags when he saw him. Jedediah Finch, standing across the street with two of his hired men. Finch didn't say a word. He just smiled, a slow, triumphant smirk that promised retribution. It was a declaration of war. Elias swung into the saddle and rode out of town, the weight of Finch's threat heavy on his shoulders. He was risking everything, his land, his legacy, what little he had left, for a woman he barely knew. And as he rode, a grim realization settled over him. He didn't regret it. Not for a second. The anger he felt toward Finch was a purer, cleaner emotion than the weary resignation he'd been living with for years. The work on the ranch became their shared language. In the weeks that followed, Clara shed her timidness like a snake sheds its skin. She rose with him at dawn, her presence at the breakfast table a silent given. She learned the rhythms of the ranch not by being told, but by watching. She saw which fence posts were loose, which of the chickens was a poor layer, how Elias favored his left shoulder when he was tired. She took over the cabin, and under her care, it transformed. The floor was always swept, the windows clean. She found a patch of workable soil near the porch, and, using seeds she'd carefully packed in her satchel, started a small kitchen garden of hardy greens and herbs. She mended his shirts, her stitches small and neat, reinforcing the worn fabric. She didn't ask permission. She simply saw a need and filled it. These were not the actions of a guest. They were the actions of a partner. Elias, in turn, began to see the strength beneath her quiet exterior. One afternoon, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled down from the mountains. A crack of lightning struck an old pine on the ridge above the cabin, and the tree exploded in a shower of splinters. His 2 horses, spooked, broke through a weak section of the corral fence and bolted. "Stay inside," he yelled to Clara over the roar of the wind and rain, grabbing a rope and sprinting after them. The ground was slick with mud. He found Boulder quickly, the gelding trembling but responsive to his voice. The other horse, a mare named Gracie, had run farther, up toward the rocky slopes. He was trying to corner her in a small box canyon when he heard a sound behind him. It was Clara, soaked to the skin, her hair plastered to her face, a bucket of oats in her hands. "What are you doing out here?" he shouted, angry and afraid for her. "She'll come for the oats," Clara yelled back, her voice thin against the wind. "She won't come to you when she's scared. You have to gentle her." She moved slowly, speaking to the mare in a low, soothing murmur. She didn't look the horse in the eye. She just stood there, offering the bucket, her small frame braced against the gale. Elias watched, stunned, as the terrified mare, after long, tense minutes, took a hesitant step toward Clara. Then another. Soon, the horse was eating calmly from the bucket while Clara stroked her neck. They led the horses back in the pouring rain, a shared, unspoken victory between them. Inside the cabin, they dripped onto the floor, shivering. Elias built up the fire while Clara toweled her hair dry. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, handing her a cup of hot coffee. "My father, before he passed, he raised horses," she said quietly. "He said you don't break a horse's spirit. You earn its trust." He looked at her then, at the fading yellow shadow of the bruise on her cheek, at the steadfast courage in her eyes. She was constantly surprising him. She was a woman of hidden depths, of quiet resilience. He was beginning to understand that he hadn't rescued her. In some strange way, they were rescuing each other. The threat of Jedediah Finch, however, was a constant, simmering pot on the verge of boiling over. One evening, as dusk was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they saw a rider approaching. It wasn't Finch. It was the town sheriff, a man named Brody. Brody was a man who preferred to keep the peace by siding with the powerful. He dismounted, his gaze sweeping over the tidy yard and the repaired porch rail. He looked from Elias to Clara, who stood silently in the doorway. "Elias," Brody said, his tone officially neutral. "Got a complaint?" "I imagine you do," Elias said, not moving from his spot on the porch steps. "Jedediah Finch filed it. Says you're unlawfully harboring his betrothed, creating a public scandal." Clara flinched at the word betrothed, a flicker of pain crossing her face. "She's not his betrothed," Elias stated, his voice like granite. "He publicly renounced her. Cast her out. In front of half the town. He says he was overwrought," Brody countered, though he didn't sound convinced. "Says you took advantage of the situation. Folks are talking, Elias. A young, unmarried woman living out here with you. It ain't proper." "What's not proper?" Elias shot back, his anger rising. "Is a man beating a woman and then leaving her stranded 1,000 miles from home." Brody shifted uncomfortably. "Finch says she arrived that way. Says she's trouble." He looked at Clara. "Ma'am, Mr. Finch is a respected man in this town. He's willing to overlook this whole incident. He's offering Elias $500 for his trouble, and he'll take you back. He says he's willing to forgive your indiscretions." The offer was an obscenity. It was the price of a prize bull. Clara's face went white. "I am not for sale," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "And I would rather die than go with that man." Elias stepped up beside her, a solid, unmovable presence. "You heard the lady, Sheriff. Now, you can take that message back to Finch. And you can tell him if he or any of his men set foot on my land again, I'll consider it trespassing." Brody held his hands up. "All right, Elias. No need for threats. I'm just doing my job. But you need to understand the position you're in. Finch has the bank. He has the council. He can make things very difficult for you." "He's already trying," Elias said. "Now get off my property." The sheriff mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. The sun had set, and the valley was sinking into darkness. Clara was trembling. "He won't stop, will he?" "No," Elias said. He looked at her, his heart aching at the fear in her eyes. He won't. That night, the dam of Clara's silence finally broke. They sat at the table, the lantern casting long shadows on the walls. The cabin felt small, a tiny fortress under siege. "There's something you need to know," she began, her hands twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. She took a deep breath, and the story she had held so tightly inside her began to spill out. "My sister's name was Eleanor. She was 2 years older than me. After our parents died, we were all each other had. She was like the sun. She could make a dead flower bloom just by looking at it." Her voice was thick with memory and grief. Elias listened, his own coffee forgotten. "Life at the orphanage was hard. Eleanor always protected me. When she turned 18, she knew she had to leave. She had no prospects, no family to take her in. She saw an advertisement in a newspaper. A wealthy rancher in the West, looking for a wife. It was Jedediah Finch." Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "His letters were beautiful," Clara continued, a bitter irony in her voice. "He wrote poetry. He promised her a garden, a home. For Eleanor, who had never had anything of her own, it was a dream. So she went. She wrote to me at first. The letters were cheerful. She described the mountains, the house. But then, they started to change. They got shorter, more strained. She stopped mentioning Mr. Finch at all." She paused, swallowing hard. "The last letter I got from her was smuggled out by a traveling preacher. It wasn't in an envelope. It was folded small, tucked inside a hymn book he was delivering to the orphanage." Clara reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the letter. It was worn, the paper softened and creased from countless readings. The ink was faded in places. This was her shield, her burden, the mystery he had only glimpsed. "He is a monster," she whispered, her voice breaking. She unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. Her sister's words filled the small cabin, a voice from the grave. "Dearest Clara, if you are reading this, it means my courage held. Do not come here. I beg of you, do not follow me. The man I married is not the man from the letters. His poetry is a lie. His house is a cage. He has a temper like a winter storm, and his hands are heavy. He delights in cruelty. He calls me stupid. He calls me worthless. Last week, he locked me in the cellar for 2 days for burning his supper. There is no garden, Clara. Nothing grows here but fear." Clara's voice hitched, but she forced herself to continue. "I am writing to the agency to tell them I am leaving him, that I have run off. It is the only way I can think of to escape. I don't know where I will go. I have no money, but I cannot stay. Do not believe him if he tells you I am happy. Do not believe any of his lies. Live your life, my sweet sister. Be free for both of us. All my love, Eleanor." Clara finished reading, her hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. That was 6 months ago. 2 weeks later, a letter came from Mr. Finch to the orphanage. He said Eleanor had run off with a passing gambler. He said she had shamed him. He was so convincing, so full of heartbreak. And then his advertisement for a new bride appeared. For me, Elias finally understood. The sheer, calculated evil of it took his breath away. "You didn't come here to marry him," he said, the realization dawning on him. "No," she said, tears finally streaming down her face. "I came here to find my sister. When I arrived, I showed him her letter. I demanded to know where she was. He laughed. He said she got what she deserved. And then he hit me. He said since he'd paid my passage, I belonged to him now, and I would learn to be obedient, just as he had tried to teach Eleanor." She looked up at him, her face a mask of anguish and desperate resolve. "I don't think she ran off, Elias. I think he killed her." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and terrible. The bruised face, the mysterious letter, it all clicked into place, forming a picture of unimaginable cruelty. Jedediah Finch hadn't just rejected a bride. He had been confronted by a witness. His public humiliation of her had been an act of panicked self-preservation, an attempt to discredit her before she could speak. Elias looked at the letter in her hand, at the tear-streaked face of the woman before him. He saw the ghosts of 2 sisters, both trapped by the same man. He thought of the land his father had bled for, the debt hanging over his head, the comfortable power Finch wielded in town. Standing against him meant risking utter ruin. But looking at Clara, at the raw courage it had taken for her to travel 1,000 miles on a sliver of hope to avenge her sister, he knew there was no choice. His own troubles seemed small and petty in the face of such a monstrous injustice. He reached across the table, and his large, calloused hand gently covered hers. "We're not going to let him get away with it," he said, his voice quiet but filled with a conviction that surprised even himself. "We're going to make him answer for Eleanor." A new kind of resolve settled over the ranch. It was no longer just about survival. It was about justice. They spent the next day in quiet, tactical discussion. Fleeing was not an option. Finch's reach was long, and Clara would not leave without knowing her sister's fate. Going to Sheriff Brody with the letter was a risk. Brody was in Finch's pocket, and the letter could be easily dismissed as the ravings of a hysterical woman, especially with Finch already poisoning the town against her. "It's her word against his," Elias said, pacing the floor of the cabin. "And in this town, his word is worth more." "But the letter," Clara began. "It's powerful," he agreed. "But it needs the right audience. Not one man in a stuffy office. It needs to be heard by everyone. All at once." An idea began to form in his mind, a gamble so audacious it was either brilliant or suicidal. "Sunday," he said, stopping his pacing. "The whole town will be at church. They can't ignore you if you're standing in front of them in the house of God." Clara's eyes widened. "Speak in church? In front of everyone? They'll think I'm mad. They already think I'm a fallen woman." "Let them think what they want," Elias said, his gaze intense. "But they will listen. When you read that letter, they won't be able to turn away. They'll see your face, what he did to you. They'll hear your sister's words. Truth has a weight to it, Clara. Sometimes you just have to drop it hard enough to make a crack." He saw fear in her eyes, but also a glimmer of hope. "You would do that? Stand with me. I'll be right beside you," he promised. The decision was made. For the next 2 days, a tense, focused energy filled the small cabin. Clara read the letter over and over, her voice growing stronger, more resolute with each recitation. Elias cleaned his father's old suit, a dark, sober wool he hadn't worn since the funeral. He oiled his best saddle and brushed Boulder until the gelding's coat shone. They were preparing for battle. On Sunday morning, they rode into Redemption Gulch. The sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. Elias wore the suit, which felt stiff and foreign. Clara wore the same simple dark dress she'd arrived in, but she'd mended it carefully. Her hair was pulled back in a neat, severe bun, and the bruise on her cheek had faded to a sickly yellow-green, a visible testament to her story. She held her head high, her back straight. She looked not like a victim, but like a Valkyrie riding into the fray. As they rode down the main street, windows parted. People stopped on the boardwalks to stare. The whispers followed them like a cloud of flies. They ignored it all. They tied their horses outside the small white church and walked up the steps together. They entered just as the preacher was beginning his sermon. Every head turned. The pews were full. Elias saw Sam Miller, Sheriff Brody, and, in the front pew, resplendent in a fine new suit, Jedediah Finch. Finch's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed into slits of pure venom. Elias led Clara straight down the central aisle. He didn't stop at a back pew. He walked her all the way to the front, stopping just before the pulpit. The preacher faltered, his words dying in his throat. A shocked silence fell over the congregation. "Preacher, I ask your forgiveness for this interruption," Elias said, his voice clear and steady, reaching every corner of the room. "But there is a matter of justice that cannot wait." He turned to the congregation. "You all know me. My name is Elias Thorne, and this is Miss Clara Maeve. Most of you have heard the stories Mr. Finch has been telling about her. About me. Now you're going to hear the truth." Finch jumped to his feet. "This is an outrage. Sheriff, remove these people. They are desecrating this holy place." Sheriff Brody started to rise, but Elias fixed him with a look. "You sit down, Brody. You're going to listen, too." To everyone's surprise, Brody hesitated, then slowly sank back into his seat. Elias turned to Clara and gave her a slight nod. "I am right here." Clara took a deep breath, her knuckles white where she clutched the letter. She looked out at the sea of hostile, curious faces. Then her gaze settled on Finch, and all her fears seemed to burn away, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. "My name is Clara Maeve," she began, her voice trembling at first, but gaining strength with every word. "I came to Redemption Gulch because I had received a letter from my sister, Eleanor. She was Jedediah Finch's first mail-order bride." A gasp went through the church. Finch's face turned a mottled red. Mr. Finch told everyone my sister ran away, Clara continued. That is a lie. This is the last letter she ever wrote. She gave it to a preacher, just like you, sir, begging him to get it to me. She held up the worn paper. And I am going to read it to you now. And she did. Her voice, clear and sorrowful, filled the sacred space. She read of the cage, the heavy hands, the cellar. She read of the fear and the desperation. The words of the dead woman echoed off the wooden walls, an indictment more powerful than any prosecutor's argument. Women in the pews began to weep silently. Men shifted in their seats, their faces grim. The story was too specific, too raw, to be a fabrication. When she finished, the silence in the church was absolute, thick with horror and shame. Clara folded the letter carefully. She looked directly at Finch. When I arrived, I asked him where my sister was. He laughed at me. He told me she got what she deserved. And then he did this. She pointed to her own bruised face. He said I belong to him now. He is not a man of God. He is a monster who preys on the helpless. Finch finally found his voice, sputtering with rage. Lies. All of it. She's a scheming, lying harlot. She's trying to ruin me. Is she? A voice called out from the back. It was Martha Miller, Sam's wife. I remember Eleanor Finch. I saw her in town once, last fall. She was buying flour. She had a bruise on her arm, a nasty one. She told me she'd walked into a door. Martha's eyes, full of a long-suppressed anger, bored into Finch. Funny how often clumsy women seem to marry men with tempers. Another woman, near the front, stood up. She came to me once, asking if I had any work. She was desperate to earn her own money. She said she wanted to buy a train ticket home. The foundation of Finch's reputation was cracking. The town's women, who had heard the whispers and seen the signs, were finding their courage. Finch looked around wildly, his face slick with sweat. His power was built on a carefully constructed facade of respectability, and it was crumbling to dust before his eyes. He lunged toward Clara. You lying witch. Elias moved so fast he was a blur. He stepped between them, his hand shooting out to grab the front of Finch's fine coat. He didn't hit him. He just held him, his grip like iron. You're not going to touch her again, Elias said, his voice a low, deadly growl. Sheriff Brody was finally on his feet, his face pale. He saw the mood of the town turning. He saw the undeniable evidence of Clara's face, the corroborating testimony of the women, the sheer menace in Finch's eyes. His political instincts for survival took over. Jedediah, Brody said, his voice firm for the first time. You need to come with me. We have some questions for you. About the disappearance of Eleanor Maeve. Finch's rage collapsed into panic. He was ruined, and he knew it. As Brody and one of his deputies led him away, the townspeople stared, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and dawning comprehension. They had been complicit in their silence. In the sudden, quiet aftermath, Elias released his breath. He turned to Clara. She was pale but upright, her ordeal over. The weight of her sister's fate had been lifted from her shoulders and laid at the feet of the community. They walked out of the church into the bright sunlight, the eyes of the town following them, but the stares were different now. They were filled not with scorn, but with a grudging respect. They stood on the church steps, the whole world seeming to hold its breath. Elias looked down at Clara, at her brave, tired face. The purpose that had driven them this far was fulfilled. A new, uncertain future stretched before them. Reckon we should see the preacher, Elias said, his voice rough. Not for a confession, for the other thing. If you'll have me, he looked away, toward the distant mountains. Make it proper. It wasn't a declaration of love in the poetic way Finch might have written it. It was something far more real. It was a statement of partnership, a promise of protection, a commitment forged in shared adversity and mutual respect. Clara looked at this quiet, steadfast man who had risked everything for her. A small, genuine smile finally reached her eyes, the first he had ever seen. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds. Yes, Elias, she said softly. I think we should. The ride back to the ranch was lighter than air. The silence in the wagon was no longer one of awkwardness or tension, but of deep, companionable peace. They had faced down the dragon and won. Justice, in a small, dusty western town, had been served, not by a gun, but by a woman's courage and a quiet man's integrity. When they reached the valley, the ranch looked different. The cabin no longer seemed shabby, but welcoming. The land no longer felt like a burden, but a future. That evening, the lamp cast a warm, golden glow on the main room. A new quiet settled between them, a stillness born not of fear, but of contentment. Elias sat at the table, cleaning the dirt from a harness buckle with an oiled rag, the simple, repetitive motion calming his soul. He was in debt, his future was uncertain, and he had made powerful enemies who would not soon forget their humiliation. But for the first time in years, he felt a profound sense of hope. Clara was humming, a soft, tuneless sound, as she sat near the fire, mending one of his shirts. The needle flashed in the firelight, her stitches sure and even, weaving together the frayed edges of the fabric, making it whole again. She had found her voice, her strength. She was no longer defined by her bruises or the tragedy of her past, but by the resilience that had brought her through it. The cabin was no longer just his shelter, it was their home. He watched her, the simple domesticity of the scene filling him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He had walked onto that train platform a lonely man, burdened by the ghosts of the past. He had acted on a single, charitable impulse. He thought he was saving a desperate woman. He realized now he had been wrong. He hadn't just found a mail-order bride with a bruised face and a mysterious letter. He had found the missing part of his own heart. He had found his reason to fight, to build, to live. And in the quiet peace of the evening, that felt like more than enough. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.